Hello and welcome to the Dr. Hibernica Comics Review. This week, I'm going to be taking a break from my busy world domination schedule to talk to you about the X-Men. Throughout history, the X-Men has been one of those super teams that's really hard for a villain to predict. Most of the Justice Leaguers or Avengers or whatever team and universe you're dealing with can't exactly go walking down the street without being recognized. Sure, a lot of them do have secret identities, but you're not going to see Thor and Cyborg walk down the street holding hands and not stop and think to yourself, hey, wait a minute, I think that's Thor and Cyborg walking down the street holding hands. The hell? But the X-Men are different. Most, if not all, of the X-Men look just like anyone else. You can be in the middle of bringing the first world's economy to its knees. It's easier than you think it is. And next thing you know, some random Chinese-looking girl from the audience is throwing explosive plasma out of her hands, and hey, there's somebody walking through the wall behind you to short out all of your equipment. It's ridiculous.
Dr. Hibernica.
Major Apollo? How the hell did you get in here?
Well, it was not that hard considering you're broadcasting from the RKO Tower, which has the worst encryption in the world. Now, I do have to ask, since it has been some years since San Diego, are you still gloating over that $200 Rob Liefeld variant cover?
Poor bastard had no idea what he had. And it was a Neil Adams, you simpleton.
Right. Now, which comic are you reviewing right now?
X-Men #1. Why do you want to know?
Well, someone has to hold you accountable for the claims you make and anecdotal evidence you cite.
You know, Apollo, this is the X-Men. I can make up any damn thing I want, and no one will be able to tell the difference. I could sit here with a perfectly straight face and tell you that Angel is possessed by an unknown entity that has magical healing powers, and that Colossus is secretly Swedish, and no one would be able to tell you which of those two was a lie.
Well, you just can't go and make stuff up.
I still prefer Deadpool's method of figuring out someone's backstory. But fine, be that way. Elucidate me.
The X-Men have become totem for our generation. I grew up watching the animated series, moved on to the Singer and Ratner films, and then, in between, reading up on the comics, first the 616 and then the Ultimate Universe. And so as you see, each of these iterations represent an important part of sort of growing up in the US stateside, which each of the comics sort of representing different eras. So you can't just go and throw in these claims you're making and play with people's childhood. I mean, we all have our own canon stored in here, even if Marvel doesn't believe there is a canon with all the alternate realities and retcons going on. Skrulls being the convenient retcon. But anyway, that is not the point. The X-Men are important, and they're important to me, and I'm here to represent the readers in pointing out your errors and preventing any more grotesque misrepresentations.
Well, as you hinted at earlier, X-Men is a huge comic franchise. Right now, there are 4 different X-Men books. And they are X-Men, All New X-Men, X-Men Legacy, and Uncanny X-Men, in addition to Ultimate X-Men, Uncanny Avengers, which is mostly mutants, Avengers plus X-Men, X-Factor, and Uncanny X-Force. The New Mutants in Generation X, not to mention Exiles, Excalibur, X-Statix, and Extreme X-Men do not currently have books. Every time Marvel has done something with a new universe, there's always an X-Men group there too. Now, the newest offering is just called X-Men. It is being written by Brian Wood, who has worked with X characters in the past, writing some of the previous X-Men titles, as well as being the current author on Ultimate Comics X-Men. He has also worked on Generation X, which contained Jubilee, who is one of the main characters of this book. He has worked on a few Vertigo titles during his career, which includes Northlanders and Supernatural, in addition to writing X-Men and Ultimate Comics X-Men, the first 2 volumes of which I recommend, by the way. Wood is also the current writer for Dark Horse's Star Wars, Conan the Barbarian, and the Massive series.
The penciler for X-Men is Olivier Coipel. Coipel has been working with Marvel for years and has a great deal of experience on the X-Men titles. He also did the art for Siege and House of M, as well as Thor. Last month, when I talked about Jupiter's Legacy #1, I mentioned Miller working on the Gen Con attempt at fastest production of a comic book, and most contributors to a comic book. Coipel was one of the artists on that book as well. This cover by Coipel and colorist Laura Martin is excellent. None of these girls are in particularly outrageous positions and look quite good. The wreckage of a Sentinel is probably one of the most iconic symbols to use to launch a new X-Men series. And I like the way the characters stand out from the background without being separated from it. Each of the team members has a unique look to her, and there's care put into each of the facial expressions. For those who don't know, the X-Men on the cover here are, from left to right, Psylocke, Jubilee, Storm, Rogue, Rachel, and Kitty Pryde. I'll cover more on the history of each of these characters a little bit later. Trust me, if you're new to X-Men, you're gonna need it. The book opens with a bit of exposition for what longtime readers may recognize as Sublime. Now, I am not a longtime reader in the X-Men universe, so when I don't understand what I'm seeing, I have to go crawl around Wikipedia for a while until I am able to understand, or I have to keep reading and trust that the author is eventually going to tell me what I need to know. This girl here is Jubilation Lee, also known as Jubilee. Jubilee made her debut as the youngest of the X-Men in the early 90s. She had the ability to shoot explosive plasma out of her hands. Many of you will know her from the X-Men cartoon of the 90s as well. Because comics are weird, Jubilee is, as of her last appearance, not a mutant anymore, but a vampire. Time will tell if this is still the case, or if Wood is going to hand-wave that away somehow. Aurora Monroe, aka Storm, is probably the most recognizable of the X-Men aside from maybe Xavier and Cyclops. Storm has power over the elements, and often her foul moods can cause bizarre meteorological phenomena. Storm has been a leader of the X-Men multiple times, and appears to be in charge here, possibly along with Kitty. Kitty Pryde is one of the X-Men of the 80s. Today, she's mostly known as either Kitty or Shadowcat, and she has grown to be a leader of the X-Men in some of the incarnations. She has a genius-level intellect, and while she doesn't lord it over others, she's not ashamed to admit it. Kitty has become wildly popular in recent years, leading to her having a central role in both All New X-Men and X-Men. For any Buffy fans out there, Joss will readily admit that Kitty was a huge influence on Buffy. Rachel Summers, or Rachel Grey, depending on who you ask, is the child of Scott Summers and Jean Grey from an alternate future timeline. This differentiates her from Cable, who is Scott and Madeline Pryor's son from a probably maybe not alternate future. So they're kind of, sort of, half-siblings? X-Men is complicated. Anyway, for anyone who is following All New X-Men, you know that Captain Chinstrap is losing his shit over the original X-Men being in the present, but no one seems to care about Cable or Rachel. Rachel has many of her mother's powers, and is a very powerful mutant in her own right. Rogue, originally a villain, is another wildly successful female character for the X-Men line. Rogue can borrow or sometimes steal powers and memories from other people. For most of her career, she had no control over this and was unable to have any kind of physical contact with anyone. More recently, she's learned to control her powers and live a more normal life. This is Psylocke. Psylocke is the twin sister of Captain Britain and was originally European in appearance, believe it or not. After a particularly weird run-in with the Hand, she now has Asian features and a tendency towards Japanese-style weapons. She has telepathic and telekinetic powers and can use her abilities to manifest psychic constructs of weapons, not terribly unlike DC's Lantern Corps. Have you figured out which of the two things I said yet was a lie when I was talking about Angel and Colossus? John Sublime. Oh geez. The book tries to explain this, but wow.
They are using a character from a Grant Morrison text. Of course it is going to require an encyclopedia of the company and a regular encyclopedia to understand it. For a fun activity, try annotated one of his comics like Batman Rip. When you are done, you will have downloaded the same amount of knowledge you would receive from a 3-credit college course.
Are you still here?
Think I'd let you off that easily? Anyway, unlike some of the characters in the comic, the author presents a section of Sublime's biography. From the comic, readers learn that he began as a sentient bacteria. However, what they do not know is that he later claimed a human host, Dr. John Sublime, who was involved with the Weapon Plus program that created fan favorites like Wolverine and Deadpool. In terms of the comics, he is known for creating the U-Men, men who harvest and graft mutant organs onto their own bodies so they could acquire the associated powers. Thus, when his history with the X-Men is to be considered, his surrender seems indicative of an ulterior agenda. The scenario of the villain wanting to be caught that has become quite popular now, whether it is Star Trek Into Darkness, Skyfall, The Avengers, The Dark Knight, and so on.
Alright, that new encryption stream should keep Apollo out.
Well, I see you've revised your encryption protocols. It looks like my time here is about to end. Just remember, Hibernica, I'll be watching.
Anyway, where was I? Yes. Now that I've spent approximately the length of an ordinary review just explaining the most rudimentary basics of the X-Men universe characters, what's actually going on in this book? Well, mostly this is an introduction. There is some action in here, but mostly it's pretty contrived. Generally, this book does do an okay job of setting up the characters, and has a pretty strong hook for future plot, particularly the introduction of Sublime's sister, and the cliffhanger at the end that I won't be discussing. An organism that can inhabit machinery is a very interesting idea. I immediately am left wondering if Cable is susceptible to her influence, even though mutants have been shown to be resistant to Sublime in the past. But time will tell. This is a much better number 1 than Green Team was, but it's nowhere near as strong as Jupiter's Legacy or The Movement. As that pain-in-the-ass superhero Apollo mentioned, Sublime is a very complicated villain, who is fairly important to the overall story of the X-Men. However, with all the baggage and weirdness that comes with him, I hope that a story surrounding him and his sister won't be so steeped in lore as to alienate new readers in a first story arc. Comparing this to the other X-Men number 1s in Marvel now, which of course I have to do, All New X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, and X-Men Legacy, X-Men definitely asks for more familiarity with the source material than the others do. While the things being dealt with in the other books are still continuations of the same X-Men stories, Bendis and Spurrier have done a good job of not expecting the reader to be a long-time reader, without throwing out those previous details. Partially, in the case of All New and Uncanny, this is handled through the original X-Men, who are just as oblivious as a new reader would be. X-Men Legacy is a whole new story with David Haller filling in any holes for the reader as needed. With a little luck, Wood will find a way to tease out the relevant history of the X-Men for readers without demanding that they read miles of back issues or spend hours on wiki crawls. The art here is beautiful, and I think it matches incredibly well with the X-Men. I really like the way the characters look, and the art really makes this whole book feel cohesive. The faces are expressive and every single panel is well composed. I just think that it works really, really well. Overall, I do think this was a very good book. I really like Wood's choice of characters. My only concern, as I've mentioned a few times now, is the depth of lore in the X-Men. If Wood is able to navigate this web of madness in such a way as to still be accessible to new readers while being respectful to old readers, I can see this book getting a nice long run. If you're new to the X-Men and you want to get a decent start without being expected to know too much off the bat, I would say pick up Bendis' current offerings instead of Wood's. But if you're already reading All New X-Men and Uncanny X-Men, or if you're a longtime X-Men fan, I see no reason not to pick this one up. I know I am looking forward to X-Men number 2.